Okay, so I did my historical analysis paper over the development of the DSM. So before the DSM was developed, mental disorders were being classified by the frequency of idiocy and insanity. This was until the government decided that they needed more sufficient data of mental illnesses. So during this, while they were collecting data, they were able to then create 7 more categories. This consisted of melancholia, paresis, mania, monomania, dipsomania, dementia, and epilepsy. So it was very challenging during this time, not only having 7 categories of mental illnesses, and so people were having to resort to using multiple resources to find a common diagnosis. There was a system developed to get health statistics from mental hospitals. The goal was to develop a psychiatric classification that could be used in a inpatient setting. And it was going to focus on those who had psychiatric and neurological disorders. The ICD is the International Classification for Disease. The first edition was created in 1893, and it was designed by the World Health Organization as a healthcare classification system. The 6th revision had already been made by 1949, and with the revisions in the 6th edition, there was a section dedicated for mental disorders. So what we now know as the APA and the National Commission of Mental Hygiene, these two came together to form over 22 different groups of mental illnesses. And while forming those groups, they then formed this statistical manual. This was considered to be the prototype for the DSM, and it contained very broad categorizations of mental disorders, and it was very limited on how you could diagnose people. In World War II, they had more involvement of U.S. psychiatrists, so because they were involved in the processing, assessments, and treatments of the soldiers. This is when the focus moved from that inpatient institutions into more like a clinical perspective. The statistical manual was then adopted by the armed forces for new classifications to provide a better understanding of possible disorders that people at war are dealing with. And with psychiatrists returning home from the military, it was easier for them to apply these new classifications into mental hospitals and clinics. So in 1952, the first DSM was published, and it was it was published by the APA, and it held over 102 very broad diagnostic categories based on psychodynamic principles. These categories were then broken down into conditions that were assumed to be caused by a brain dysfunction, or conditions that were assumed to be resulted by the effects of environmental stress in a person that resulted in an inability to adapt. So the second one, with the result of, it was then subdivided into either psychosis or psychoneurosis. Psychosis meaning like your severe conditions, such as schizophrenia or like your manic depressive disorders, and psychoneurosis, which is your personality disorders and depression and like anxiety disorders. So when the DSM was created, many people thought it would be beneficial because it was creating like common language for people, for mental health professionals to use to help diagnose their patients. But really, this manual had very little diagnostic efficiency and little influence on actually the diagnostic process. So APA received a lot of feedback about things that they could improve on to make the DSM more reliable and easier to understand. So it was hard to follow, like I said. Okay, so like I said, it was hard to follow because the descriptions of what each specific category, they were then characterized in like paragraph forms. So this was designed so it was easier for psychiatrists and other mental health professionals to communicate better based on that paragraph description. But most people actually found it more challenging to actually interpret the description in the same way. So one other thing that they found bad with the first revision of the DSM was that they used words like reaction. So when trying to describe like potential behaviors of someone, they would use the word reaction, but this was later removed from the DSM because mental health professionals believed it was implying causality. And also some people considered the DSM to be too closely related to the ICD. So then they were back to using multiple resources. If they couldn't find it in the DSM, then they were looking in the ICD, and they were looking at other places. And because it was also hard to follow and many people interpret it in different ways, some people were falsely diagnosed. So obviously APA had to make some revisions to make the DSM. So APA had to come back because by the early 1960s, people were already considering the manual like not being valid, like not useful to them anymore. So in ways that they were able to make revisions and kind of bounce back, they did an expansion on mental illness, and they did this by including those milder conditions, ones that you kind of see out in like the general public. And they created a more systematic categorization so it's easier to follow along with. And the language, they were able to create a more efficient language for people to communicate well with. And also with each revision of the DSM, there's also a revision of the ICD, so they kind of have to stay on top of it. And the future of the DSM, this is a quote I found, the DSM will continue to exist as a living, evolving document that can be updated and reinterpreted. So this is APA's future hopes for the DSM, that it can just keep evolving, and they hope to achieve this by using a continuous ongoing revision instead of a set interval revisions. Do you have any questions? Yes?
Do you think that the ICD will advance enough that we won't need the DSM anymore?
I don't think that the ICD, I think the ICD is making advancements, but I don't believe that we will not have the need for the DSM because it does contain important information that won't be included in the ICD. Yes?
Do you think APA has set like programs of like making these revisions?
Yes, they do have a program developed where they have a web, what do you call it? Where they can submit forms to APA for revisions, and then APA sits down as a committee and they kind of talk over them and they make revisions like ongoing as people are submitting these revisions.